Good morning, Vietnam!
Good morning, Vietnam!
We start off this week with, yet again, the door. I needed to find a way to clad the back of this door with whatever materials I have on hand, but before that I needed to make sure that my surfaces were prepared. First, I vacuumed everything off, and then I masked off the windows to protect them from paint, dust, etc. After that, I went to my camper and, off camera, I ripped out a couple sheets of paneling. I thought about using sheet steel or trying to make something out of plywood, but I was trying to make as much of this project out of leftover materials as I could, so this is what I opted for. Now, because these sheets are used, I had to remove all the staples and screws and whatever else was used to hold these sheets to the walls. Next, I trimmed the sheets to the rough sizes that I would need. I'm gonna trim them to the final size later on in the video. After a quick test fit and yet another pass with the vacuum, I used some construction adhesive to stick the panels to the door. Then I grabbed some clamps and as many heavy items from around the workshop as I could find to put pressure on the panels so that they would adhere properly. A few days later, I came back with the router with a flush trim bit to trim the panels to the same size as the door. Once that was done, I came back with the sander and sanded the living daylights out of it. On these inside corners of the windows, the router didn't quite get all the way into the corner, so I grabbed a utility knife and cut the material away. I wasn't too concerned with getting the window cutouts perfect because I plan on trimming this out, and the trim will cover that anyways. I had to use the back side of the panels as my outward-facing surface because the wallpaper on these panels was, well, it wasn't only ugly, but they were in pretty poor shape, and that left me with a bit of a problem. If you've ever tried to paint raw paneling, a lot of times you're able to see the surface through the paint. To remedy this, I used a skim coat of body filler to fill in those gaps. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best option that I had. I did multiple coats of the body filler, which turned my panel red. I kinda like this look if I'm being honest, but it doesn't fit with the look I'm going for on this bus, so it's going to be painted over. After the filler dried, I sanded it down and then, yet again, vacuumed it off. Next, I wiped down the surfaces with a damp rag and then painted the first coat onto the back of this door. Now, this is not the final color of the door. I didn't have any primer, so I used leftover paint as a primer as a way to keep the door waterproofed for now. I did a few coats of this, and then after they dried, it was time to work on the front side. With some help, I got the door flipped over and set to work on filling gaps and holes with body filler. I already did a first coat of this before I primed it, but after seeing the results once it was primed, I wasn't satisfied with how it looked, so I decided to do it again. It was much easier to see the spots that I missed with the paint now making the surfaces one color, and I'm glad I decided to do this. Once more I gave it a sand, and then, you guessed it, I vacuumed it off. Another quick wipe down with a damp rag, and then another coat of primer. A few days later I came back and repeated the process because there were still some holes that I didn't quite get. While I was working on this, I bought some hinges and I decided that I wanted to see what the spacing would look like on them. This comes up later as well, so I'll explain a little bit more about that then. So, yet again I sanded, vacuumed, wiped down, and then primed. Yes, the primer was grey this time. I ran out of the black and only had grey as a backup. It doesn't really matter because once everything is done, this door is going to get painted a different color anyways. So here's where that hinge spacing comes into play. Here you can see I'm drawing out the dimensions of the door from a downward viewpoint. I needed to do this so that I could figure out how wide my door jamb needed to be. I needed to take into account how much room I needed to allow the door to swing, including the width of the hinges. To do this, I measured the width, including the extra 1/4 inch for the hinge, and thickness of the door. Then I calculated the diagonal measurement from those dimensions. This gave me the final minimum width that I would need on my door jamb, which worked out to be 31 inches. Now here is where I made a mistake. At this point, I should have added at most an extra 1/4 inch to account for weather seals and whatnot. I added a full inch, thinking that it would be added evenly to both sides. I forgot that the hinges are a set width, and that the entire extra space would only end up on one side of the door. Unfortunately, I went ahead with widening the door frame to this width, and I would have to make up this difference in space later. I started off by gathering materials. One of my favorite materials to use for fabrication is bed frame. It's readily available and remarkably cheap if you buy them used. Next, I had to remove the original door jambs because not only were they curved inward, they were also not deep enough for the new thickness of the door. This turned out to be a bigger challenge than I originally anticipated, but between the grinder and the sawzall, I got her done. After measuring out how much I thought needed to be removed, I marked my lines and began cutting. So here's my mistake in its full glory. At this point, I was still under the impression that I was doing this correctly and was none the wiser. So as a material, bed frame is amazing, but it doesn't come in the lengths that I needed for the height of this door jamb. So I had to cut and weld some pieces together to make the pieces that were long enough. Once the welds were cleaned up, I cut my newly formed door jambs to their final height. Using the grinder, I cleaned the paint off the existing surfaces of the door jamb so that I would have a good starting point to weld from. I clamped the bed frame pieces in place and set to welding them in. As I worked on this, I had to be careful to keep the two sides as parallel as possible, so I used metal tabs to kind of hold everything in place until I could fill the gaps. After the two sides were in place, I needed to build the top door frame. After I measured the width, I cut another piece of bed frame to fit and welded it into place. I used clamps to keep everything as flush as possible, and I ended up filling a lot of holes with welding because I suck at cutting straight lines. What you're seeing me do here is cutting one of those tabs I mentioned earlier. This one was to hold the one side of the door jamb to the width that I needed. I decided to go with sheet metal to fill in the gaps on this one side because I already had some long strips left over from when I did the roof raise, and all I had to do was trim it to length. I welded the two pieces in place on the front side of the door jamb, and I was really pleased with the results. I then started on the other side, which was a bit more complicated. I found this sheet of seat rail and decided that I would use that on the top half of the door. I measured my lines and cut it to shape. I forgot to turn on my camera for the next section, which is a shame because I really struggled to get that piece of metal welded in place. It was very thin, so I kept blowing holes through it, even with the heat on the welder set to its lowest setting and the wire speed turned up. A lot of the work you're seeing here I later ended up removing because I just didn't like the way it was coming together. But basically I cut out these strips of metal and was welding them in place, but they kept bending on me, and they ended up looking terrible. I ended up cutting some of these strips out and replacing with sheet metal that I slid into place behind the door jamb and welded in place. This looked a million times better and will likely be a more waterproof solution. I basically wasted an entire day cutting out and redoing my work from the previous day. This included that thin sheet of metal that I kept melting holes through with the welder. I cut it out with the angle grinder and cleaned up the surfaces as best as I could. I grabbed some more of that leftover sheet metal from the roof raise and used that instead. I measured and cut a new piece of metal and clamped it in place so that it could be welded in. Even though my welds look like boogers, this was a much better outcome than the previous way I had this. It's much stronger and will likely be much more water resistant than what I did before. I continued to fill all the gaps and holes that I could find, and then use the grinder to clean everything up. As they say, grinding in paint make me the welder I ain't. So the hinges that I bought are outdoor hinges, but they were a bit big, so what I'm doing here is test fitting them to prepare for the installation of the door. The hinges needed to be trimmed so that they would fit within the door jamb, which isn't ideal, but I had to work with what I was able to afford. I also picked these hinges because the pins can't be removed, which is far more secure. I mounted the hinges to the door jamb using one self-tapping screw per hinge temporarily. I did not use the screws that came with the hinges because they were pretty cruddy and would not be strong enough for this application. Now that the door jambs were mostly complete, I, still unaware of the mistake I'd made in widening the door jamb, began the process of installing the door. First, I removed the electric hoist that I used when I was building the door inside the bus. I mounted it to the bucket of my dad's tractor using straps. Now, what follows is a classic example of do as I say, not as I do. I rigged up the door to the electric winch and used the tractor to lift the door out of the workshop. This worked pretty well, but to install the door it needs to be vertical, not horizontal, so I had to set the door down and re-rig it so that the tractor could lift it into place. I quickly realized that the loader of the tractor did not lift high enough for me to be able to get the door off the ground, so I had to rig it again from further down. All of this rigging took place under the raised bucket of the tractor. Anyone who knows how hydraulics works knows that this is not a good idea, and I should have known better. At any moment, the hydraulics on that tractor could have failed, the bucket could have come down on my head, potentially seriously injuring or even unaliving me. This was stupid. Do not emulate what I did here. Once I got the door so that it would lift high enough, I attempted to attach it to the bus. I, in my incredible wisdom, decided to do this on a windy, rainy day. This made attaching the door all but impossible. I won't go into detail about how I ended up getting the door on, but it involved lots of cursing and unsavory promises to the door's mother. Eventually, I managed to get the top of the door somewhat connected to the door jamb with the hinge. I brought in an ATV jack, and now that I no longer needed the tractor to hold the door up, I lifted from the bottom of the door to get the hinges all lined up. Once I got a few screws into the hinges, my job became much easier, and I was able to completely mount the door into place. It was at this point that I realized that I'd made the door jamb too wide. I stared at it for probably a good 10 minutes, trying to come up with a solution while also kicking myself for not having anticipated this. Regardless, I carried on sinking screws into the hinges. As I worked on that, I kept thinking about my width problem, and out of curiosity, I grabbed this garage door channel and found that it was pretty much the perfect width that I needed. After cutting the piece of metal to the length that I needed it to be, I ground down the rivets near where I made my earlier cut so that they wouldn't interfere with welding. I then set the metal in place and started to tack it in. As I did this, I went along and made sure that the door would still swing closed and made any adjustments to the filler piece as needed. Once I was satisfied with the filler piece's location, I went ahead and fully welded it in. You probably have also noticed that I cut a small notch in the door jamb here. This was to make room for the locking mechanism, but I'll show you that in another video. For now, enjoy a montage of me filling holes with weld and cleaning it up with grinding. I also applied some body filler to the welds to smooth them out a bit, but I neglected to film for that. Either way, this was the final result, and I'm happy how it turned out. The garage door rail worked out to be perfect for this and gave me a nice rounded surface that looks clean. This turned out to be a bit of a blessing in disguise because I would have had to round it off anyways, and this saved me quite a bit of work. And that's going to be all for this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be eternally grateful if you'd consider liking and subscribing. It's by no means necessary, but it helps my channel grow. I also have another channel where I play video games. It's called Cinebeam, and if you enjoy gaming content, feel free to give it a look. Link is in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, enjoy your day, and I'll see you next time.